Yes, I'm very happy to be back. I really am. Back just in time to talk to this guy, the former federal prosecutor. Now he works the defense side of the table. You can hear him on London radio. They hit him for various analyses on any number of legal issues in this country, on Fox News Channel, on KNX radio in Los Angeles, on KCBS radio in San Francisco. He's everywhere. But I've got him for you every Thursday out of the kindness of David Katz's heart. Here he is, David Katz, everybody.
Well, it's great to be with you, Mark. You're a great interviewer, and really, I enjoy being with you a lot.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate that. And I want to start I know we got the Trump stuff, and we will get to it, but I want to talk about this thing that you had touched on before, what was going on in a Minnesota courtroom, where essentially they're trying to point out that Donald Trump was in violation of the 14th Amendment stipulation as to who can run for president. I mean, he is behind this insurrection and the attempt to turn over the democracy. As a result, he shouldn't be eligible to be on the ballot, is the argument that was made in Minnesota. What did that Minnesota judge decide, and how did she decide it?
Well, this was the Supreme Court of Minnesota. There's a case pending in front of a trial judge in Colorado. But this case went directly up to the Minnesota Supreme Court. Depending how it had been decided, the only appeal now would be to the U.S. Supreme Court, asking them to accept certiorari. They could or could not. And it doesn't look like anyone is going to go to the U.S. Supreme Court based on this Minnesota Supreme Court state decision. What they said, they kind of ducked the issue. They kicked the can down the road because what they said is there's no statute in Minnesota that precludes a political party from nominating someone who's ineligible. So if you were a 25-year-old who really caught fire and you were about to win the Republican primary in Minnesota, apparently they couldn't keep you off the ballot because no statute stops the Republican Party from nominating somebody for president who's obviously ineligible for the job, someone who's merely 25 years old. And so they kicked the can down the road by saying, well, he's not nominated yet, and there's no statute that says that he cannot be nominated. So let's wait and see if he gets nominated early next year, and then we would take his emergency appeal at that point. Now, there's an idea in this ripeness. You know, the idea is it's not ripe yet. There are some cases that sort of never become ripe. Maybe a case of someone who's in gestation. You know, there's a fetus involved, and by the time the case gets through the appellate circuit, it's always going to not be ripe or it's going to be moot. But they apparently don't think it's that kind of a case. It's one that they can get to. It's not what we call capable of repetition, but evading review. It would be reviewed if, in fact, the Republicans nominate Trump. Now, what else is interesting is that the Republicans, I think, have to think long and hard in these states. Do they really want to nominate Trump instead of someone like Haley, who would clearly be eligible to run and face off against Biden or whoever? Do they really want to nominate someone who gets knocked off the ballot in one of these states? So I guess that's what's going on right now. But Minnesota is not going to keep him off the ballot. And Trump says great victory, which it's not. It's just kicking the can down the road. And I think the state doesn't want to go to the U.S. Supreme Court right now because the state officials who are trying to keep Trump off the ballot in Minnesota because he's not eligible, because he engaged in the insurrection by, encouraging the marauding of the Capitol on January 6th. I think they think it's not a case the Supreme Court would take right now. So it's kind of a big nothing burger, but interesting legally as hell.
Yeah, and I think, and this I'd love to get your thought on it. You could take Trump off the ballot in states where he likely wouldn't carry anyway, and it may not affect the election. But when you get to states where he might win, you do begin to affect the election prominently. I mean, it's a bad look, but Trump would play it as the aggrieved party to be taken off the ballot in certain states. But it's likely the states that would take him off, he wouldn't carry anyway, I guess is my point.
Yes, well, the rubber really hits the road in a state like Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is controlled by Democrats. A Democratic attorney general or secretary of state on behalf of the ballot could bring this kind of lawsuit in the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. And then if the Pennsylvania Supreme Court said Trump cannot be on the ballot, he'd have to go to the U.S. Supreme Court right away. But I think the U.S. Supreme Court would take that case. And I think if you're betting money, probably 5-4, 6-3, they say that Trump has a federal right to run for president, and his federal right is being abridged or denied by the ruling of the state court in Pennsylvania. That would be his federal question. That would be his way to get to the U.S. Supreme Court. So that's why, on balance, although I think David K. Johnston, I mentioned this, has argued very persuasively on this issue, and I certainly get it, that this is a sui generis kind of unique insurrection. And so the counter, which is they could invent some insurrection that supposedly Biden or Newsom or whoever was part of and try to keep them off a ballot in a swing state and tilt the presidency against Biden or Newsom, I don't think really is going to occur, because the insurrection of the Capitol on January 6th was so much the sort of thing that the framers of the 14th Amendment had in mind. And whatever made up insurrection there would be later on is not what they had in mind. But again, just to clear the decks, I think if this ever goes to the U.S. Supreme Court, and it would before it really had teeth, I think the U.S. Supreme Court would allow Trump to stay on the ballot. And so I think he'll be on the ballot in all 50 states. If you want to beat him, organize and vote. Don't wait for a court.
Yeah, so well put. And, I'm just looking to see exactly the consistency of Minnesota is sort of purplish, you know what I mean? So it's interesting to look over. There are 10 electoral college votes, by the way, in Minnesota. So moving on now to the clear GOP frontrunner, Donald Trump, and his family, all of whom were sort of paraded through the same courtroom on this fraud. The fraud trial, the guilty part or the liability part has already been decided, David. You made that clear. So now we're hearing testimony that will affect penalty. Is that what's going on?
Yes. And of course, we had the zany, bombastic appearance of Trump. I like to quote the movie And Justice for All, where Pacino says, "I'm out of order, Judge. You're out of order." This was Trump. "Judge, I'm a fraud. You're a fraud." Let me tell you, the judge is not a fraud. He had every right in the world to decide this. Trump says, "You decided against me without even knowing me." Well, that happens to you. Courts don't get to know you. And, to know Trump, I believe, and what he's shown us, right, as voters, as people who've had to live under his realm as president for 4 years, we know him, and we get the fact that he is one of the biggest frauds to ever come down the pike. And what he did was just gross fraud, and what his organization did. Let me just give you a couple of examples. First of all, the complaint was over 200 pages against him. He did everything he could to obstruct that complaint being filed. He tried to obstruct the investigation. He didn't turn over to the state attorney general the discovery he was required to. He got fined $110,000 back then. And then finally, when the case went forward, we had such wonderful chestnuts as he has an apartment, which he said was 3 times as large as it is. That's not an opinion, that's a measurement. He said it was worth 3 times what it was because he lied and said it was 3 times as large. That was a key part of his financial statements. Another feature was that he took places that either had rent control or rent stabilization, and so they could only, let's say, get $2,000 a month rent. He said, well, in the market, people get $10,000 a month. Well, yes, they get $10,000 a month rent on places that aren't rent controlled and rent stabilized. So to say that his places would rent for $10,000 and there were so many units, he magnified 8 times or 6 times, whatever, what he could actually get for that apartment. He took places like Mar-a-Lago, where there's a covenant and an agreement not to develop it into condos, and he stated a value, $1.5 billion, as though it could all be broken into condos and be sold as 1,000 condos when it can't be broken into condos at all. And on it went. One last thing about that case, because a lot of people have talked about the fact that he not only overvalued the properties for the banks, but he undervalued them as to the state taxing officials. As I see it, the undervaluation to the state taxing officials is not part of this particular case. The reason that he might get hit for $250 million in damages is because that's what the banks, had they known the truth, would have charged them for the loans. They would charge them, so far the proof is at least $160 million more for the loans. He would have had a higher interest rate, and he would have had to pay $160 million more. That's whether the properties, Mark, made money or not. Now, he had good luck that real estate in New York went up, but had it gone down, he would have been one of those people who couldn't have covered, because his financial statements claimed he had assets worth at least $3 billion. He didn't have them. So if it went down, he couldn't cover. And that was the idea of having collateral. That was the idea of having financial statements that falsely said he was worth $3 billion. That's why he kept saying he was worth $3 billion. And that's what Ivanka Trump got herself involved with, even though the statute of limitations ran against her, because once Trump got to be president, she had nothing more to do with the real estate company. She and her husband went off and made friends with the Saudis, and her husband now has the $2 billion chunk of change to invest for the Saudis. But she was not involved in the real estate, so she got lucky. The statute of limitations had run, but she was all part of that thing, knowing that her father had to have financial statements that showed he was worth $3 billion. She communicated with the banks about that, and that's why she was in trouble. But she made a lovely impression. She smiled, and she wasn't bombastic like Daddy.
Yeah, well, she was very red carpety when she entered. You know, that she had the red carpet bounce to her step, and it was a weird. It felt like the Met. Is it the Met opening that they do in New York?
Gala.
Yeah, the Met Gala.
She just come from the wedding. She just come from the wedding or something with her friend Kim Kardashian. So she's not with all those crude people, you know, like Michael Cohen anymore and Weisselberg. Now she has new friends, the Kardashians.
So I think it's really important, something David said, in addition to everything that David said, but there is, not that you should necessarily cry tears for the banks, but when inflating wealth, you get a better deal from the banks than you would otherwise. And so Trump skated on the deal he'd actually get had his assets actually been valued at what they are. And so that's part of this case. But you touched on something else, David Katz, and that is the tax avoidance associated with the undervaluing of properties to the man. Okay, so you're telling the man, I don't have these properties worth a lot of money, because you're trying to skate on big taxes, which are related to how much the properties are worth. But you're telling the banks that they're worth a whole ton because you're looking for that break that I just described in terms of the loan. Talk to me about the taxes and when the state, or if the state, is going to come after Donald Trump for some of that.
Well, you know, Trump picked the head of the IRS, and the head of the IRS picked by Trump was extremely controversial. Somehow the IRS under Trump's pick managed to pick out for two incredibly intrusive audits Trump's two biggest enemies at the FBI. This has been investigated by some special prosecutor, special investigator, and said it was a mathematical chance, 1 in 10 million, that both Comey and the fellow under him, who were huge enemies of Trump from Trump's point of view, they both got picked for these audits that were incredibly intrusive. It starts with, like, what's your name? And then they say, okay, where's your birth certificate? And it goes on from there. People say, you know, it's like a mugging, but by the IRS. So he was a very controversial IRS commissioner. He was picked by Trump. Anyway, he did not, and the IRS did not, criminally investigate or refer Trump for criminal prosecution for cheating on his taxes. I'm shocked to find out that that happened under the Trump administration. So now you turn to the state, right? And, you know, the state sometimes is very lax about collecting taxes. They sort of figure they'll take the lead from the feds. That's a lot of times what happens. So with Mar-a-Lago, for instance, he said that Mar-a-Lago couldn't be developed. It was worth very little money. And so he didn't pay much. I think they have property tax down there. I think they have some kind of income tax, but it may be that that's why people go to Florida, because they don't pay much income tax. So he might not have evaded much income tax. The property tax, apparently nobody made much of a big deal about that. And then in the state of New York, remember, people expected that he would be prosecuted for that. That local prosecutor, that DA, the one who could lock Trump up, who could bring criminal charges, he had the special prosecutors. They were looking at this whole thing to bring the state taxes and the overvaluation as to the banks as a state prosecution. And then the newly elected DA in New York decided not to go on that case. That was Bragg. Those two people quit. One of them, it was very controversial. He wrote a book about it. And then after a while, Bragg didn't bring that case, although people thought that was the big case that was going to be the vehicle to put Trump in jail finally. He brought just the Michael Cohen case, the Stormy Daniels case, the not disclosing as a campaign contribution it was a campaign violation to have paid Stormy Daniels over $100,000 to have Michael Cohen pay it. So that case is still pending. That's the first case that was brought. That's the case where people said, oh my God, after all the things Trump has done wrong, that's the only criminal music he's going to face. And then, of course, there have been the three major cases since then, in my view, not only more substantial, but also much clearer in terms of the evidence, overwhelming in terms of the evidence than that New York not properly keeping business records as to paying Stormy Daniels.
Just on those cases, David, because I think, you have made this point that they are more, in a way, relevant, or more the prospects and penalties are far more grave, might be another way to put it. The timeline on those is still, on some of them, not good. Good for Trump, but not good for justice being done, or at least being heard in a courtroom prior to the election. But what about the J6? What about the Jack Smith case? Is that timeline also one that now appears cloudy, or what? Give us the latest on that.
No, I don't think that one's cloudy. I think that's the one that may actually get to trial before the election. And, when they took that poll where, because of all the problems in the world and, ongoing inflation, Biden actually finished behind Trump in some of the major swing states. But they also asked people, that New York Times poll, what if Trump got found guilty, by a jury? And that would change enough people's mind that even at this, I believe, momentary dip in his popularity, even now, Biden would be ahead of Trump with those people who were polled, because if the jury came back and found Trump guilty. So that is something that really could happen with a trial that will begin in March, the January 6th case, before Judge Chutkan in the D.C. federal court, where I was a law clerk some moons ago, but in that courthouse where I was a law clerk. And she is very focused on the fact that this case needs to get to trial and not to fall for any of these defense stratagems, which might be totally legitimate in another case. But here there is a huge public interest in getting Trump to trial and finding out from a jury of his peers whether they think he's guilty or not guilty. Let him trumpet a not guilty verdict if that's what's in his future. I don't think that's what's in his future in the January 6th trial. But Mark, they've done a couple of things to make sure that case does stay on track. One is that the special prosecutor has identified two issues that could lead to an interlocutory appeal. Generally, you have to bring all of your complaints about how unfairly you were treated by the judge in rulings, in motions, in how he or she handled the jury in your case. Bring it all at the end in what's called the final judgment rule. But there's two things that you can appeal early. And the idea is if the appellate court said, well, we need to hear this and decide it's going to take more time, they might delay the trial while they did so. One is the so-called presidential immunity, which I think is nonsense. I don't think there is such a thing that precludes a former president from being trialed. People haven't heard of such a thing. It's inventive, and I think it's a loser. The other thing is double jeopardy. He actually makes this claim, which I think is frivolous, that having been tried by the Senate for impeachment, the second trial in the Senate, he has had double jeopardy as to a federal indictment against him. Now, we don't have double jeopardy if there's a state case and a federal case about the same nucleus of facts. So there is no way that this is a winner. But there is a rule that a double jeopardy claim can be appealed because you have the right not to be put in jeopardy twice. Not a right to complain after the trial under the final judgment rule. You have a right not to be put in jeopardy twice. So you say, wait a second, I'm about to be put in jeopardy twice. Court of Appeals, you need to decide this. So Jack Smith said to the judge, decide these two so that if you rule in the government's favor, they can run to the Court of Appeals and not delay your March trial. The other thing that they've just done is regarding the advice of counsel. And if you'd like to talk about that, it's
this is really key. Let's finish with this because this is super important.
So the advice of counsel goes like this. If he really did rely on lawyers, now there's a whole lot of doubt about that because remember the judge in the Central District of California, right here, actually the court that sits in Orange County is part of our district, the one where I was an assistant United States attorney for years. Judge Carter down there had an issue because Professor Eastman was trying to keep his files secret under attorney-client privilege. And the judge said there's an exception to the attorney-client privilege. the crime fraud exception. If you were committing a crime or a fraud, or if Trump was committing one with you, you don't have a right to commit a crime or a fraud with an attorney any more than you have a right to commit a crime or a fraud with anyone else. And the judge looked at those papers and said, you know what? You guys were more likely than not committing a crime or a fraud. You and or Trump. It's enough if only Trump was doing it through you. That means that Trump doesn't have a right under attorney-client privilege to keep it secret. So we already have a ruling from a very distinguished federal judge, which was not won on appeal. So it's a standing decision. It's only a trial court decision, but still it's a standing decision. If you want to make this advice of counsel defense, you can't just say, well, a lawyer told me at a cocktail party. There's all these things that you have to do. And then the other side is entitled to discovery. So Trump agreed that he would do this by January 15th. If he hadn't agreed, the judge might have imposed an even earlier date. But she imposed January 15th, by which he has to tell the court, one, I will rely on the advice of counsel. Number two, here are all the documents that would otherwise be privileged that I am going to rely on. And number three, and this is key, all the documents that are relevant to undercut my defense. You can't cherry pick. So if you go to the lawyer and you tell him, look, all the people are telling me this is a terrible thing. We lost in 60 courts. I can't get an opinion from anybody. And the lawyer says to you, well, I really want to work at your administration. Okay. So let me tell you my advice about it. There's a special way you can do this. You can't hold that document back and just give them the second or third meeting with Eastman, or just the memo where Eastman says to you, everything you're doing, Mr. President, is lawful. You can stay in office under my plan A, B, C, and D. So that's what he's going to have to turn over. And I've been in a lot of battles like that. I've had a case that was a genuine advice of counsel and also advice of accountant, but we had to turn over everything. And they did a very vigorous job of going through it and trying to make an issue of it. And then the court decides, can you put on the advice of counsel? Can you not put on the advice of counsel? How much of it really might be stricken, or something that you shouldn't be able to present. So I think ultimately he's going to go nowhere because he got so much advice from counsel that was, White House counsel, that was very distinguished, that had said 4 or 5 things that he wanted to do, he could do. But they said, no, Mr. Trump, you cannot do this. You lost all the cases. There's no basis for it. Barr actually went out of his way to do things that he really shouldn't have done under the regulations to run down all of Trump's crazy theories. And he said, I've run down your crazy theories. I've overturned all of these rocks. And guess what? There's nothing under the rocks. You lost fair and square everywhere. There's no basis for fraud. And then Trump tried to get rid of him. So all of that is going to come in. Whether Trump discussed that with the lawyers, Mark, is going to come in. And ultimately, that one's not going to work. But that's one he loves to bandy about. And that was one of the ones that people say, John Lauro, who I know, and I think is a good lawyer, under a lot of pressure from Trump, obviously, to do Trump's bidding. I think he went a little bit too far with the press where he said, we're going to rely on advice of counsel. And you go and say things like that to the media, it may be good for the base, but then you're going to get emotion just like this. You're going to rely on advice of counsel. So your attorney says to the media, well, we want you to tell us by January 15th, and we want you to produce all those documents, good, bad, the good, the bad, and the ugly, about your supposed advice of counsel defense. And of course, you're in contempt if you don't do it.
We have to wrap up, but I think you make such a good point there at the end here, because what we're seeing, you saw it in the Trump testimony, you see them saying one thing to the media, and then the stuff they say to the media, they have to own in a courtroom, and you can't quite get away with that. And Trump's popping off on the witness stand seemed to be designed just to get out to the media. I mean, he knew that this case is gone. I mean, that was my sense of it. And he was just simply trying to pollute the discourse with whatever he had to say. David, I have to wrap. I so appreciate your time. We didn't even get to the boat case. They found that boat captain, I guess manslaughter is what they got him on, right, David? It was multiple manslaughter.
A kind of involuntary manslaughter. I saw that one coming. I am going to take 17. And Mark, I'm glad that you brought it up.
Katz is still, unbeaten.
It was a huge tragedy. All of those people passed away. I think a couple of your viewers wrote in and said that they knew somebody.
Yes.
And my condolences and everybody's condolences. But, his argument was that he's a 66-year-old guy. He was just making a day rate while he was out there. But he'd been a captain for a long time. And whether he was rich or not, he should have taken care to have a night watchman. they said that the defense tried to argue, well, it's so expensive to have a patrol boat and the patrol boat might have missed it. Mark, it wasn't just a patrol boat. Someone should have been sitting there whose job was to stay up all night, and the first sign of fire, not because they're in a patrol boat somewhere nearby, they're sitting right there on that ship, and they're making sure that boat, making sure. And then the other thing I always wanted to know, and I don't know all of these details, is how hard was it to open that hatch so that the people could get out? But to jump from that ship when you're the captain, I don't care how many flames you see, and not first, at least open that hatch, right?
Yeah.
And then there was the whole thing about how he hadn't trained the crew how to use the hoses properly. And there were hoses that, had they been trained, they could have put out that fire. And I don't mean to make people sad, but probably save some of those people's lives.
It was so negligence. Go ahead, yeah.
The last thing I want to say before I go is that News Nation now has the new Republican debate. And I'm on News Nation with Natasha a lot of weekends, so I'm happy.
Look at you, David Katz, Mr. News Nation now. I love it. Well, we love having you here.
Natasha on the weekend, Mark Thompson and Kim during the week.
I love it. Watch from this weekend on News Nation. There he is. That's Katzadamus, that's the artist conception of what he would look like if he were Nostradamus. But he is remarkable with his predictions and in the world and the legal realm that he occupies. Thank you, David Katz.
Great to be with you.
Bye, David. Really do appreciate it. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.